Hey, what's up, YouTube fans? So, what I wanted to talk about in this video, right, is the hypocrisy of arguments for intelligent design, right? Theological arguments, arguments for design in nature, from a God, or that any type of natural phenomenon needs to be explained by a God. The hypocrisy, right, is that they will be insistent that it's obvious that there needs to be a designer behind nature, right? And they will be keen on doing, probability arguments when it comes to things like the origin of life, right? So Stephen Meyer on that one video, he was, doing probability arguments of like, oh, what's the probability of it being by chance? But then when you turn it around and say, well, okay, let's calculate the probability that there will be a God that exists without a cause, right? A designer, right? You get a lot of hand waving, a lot of, they'll tend to be dismissive of the question, they'll act like that it's a ridiculous question and that we should just take for granted that a God would happen to exist, and so, everything that we're trying to explain with a God, that needs an explanation, but, God himself, we could just take for granted that he would happen to be there. Why though? They'll just say like, oh, well, because he's God. But why doesn't he need an explanation himself? Logically, he would need an explanation. If he is at all complex himself and set up in a perfect way, he would likewise need an explanation, because it would be improbable that he would happen to be like that himself by chance, right? But even though they're keen on talking about, oh, what is the probability of life existing by chance, right? They don't want to talk about like, oh, what is the probability that a God would exist, right? A designer, right? And some of them will say that God isn't complex. He isn't made out of parts, according to some of them, but then the idea has no explanatory power because he's unlike any designer that we ever observe, and no one can explain how he does the things that he does, right? So it's not an explanation then, right? But they will oftentimes be very arrogant about these types of arguments because they will insist that it's common sense, right? So, no need to do any research on it or, any deep thought. All I need to do is just look around and it should be obvious that there must be a God, right? Even though no one can explain why would God himself exist, how does God do the things that he does? But just because there's mysteries we don't know the answer to, the answer has to be God did it. And even though they're so arrogant where they'll insist that it's just obvious common sense, right? When you press them on questions like, how does God himself work? Why does he exist? They just fall back on like, oh, he's just so beyond us, so beyond us that we just can't comprehend it. But it's like, if you can't comprehend your own explanation, supposed explanation, then how is it common sense that this is the case, right? If you yourself can't comprehend the basics of your own explanation, why this thing itself would exist, how this thing itself works, then how is it common sense that that has to be the explanation? It isn't, right? Um, and so I mean, and they oftentimes when it comes to like the probability of God himself existing, they'll try and give an answer to it, but it won't really actually explain it. They do a lot of hand waving, not directly answering the question of how do you account for the improbability that God himself would happen to exist without a cause, right? They try to dodge it by saying things like, oh well, he exists outside of space and time and he doesn't have a cause, he caused everything else, he's the cause of all of reality and the ground of reality. That doesn't address it though. It's like none of that addresses why would he himself, if he is complex, right, why is he himself set up in a perfect way, right? Whereas if he isn't at all complex, then you don't actually have a model. You can't explain how does it work, how does he do the things he does. You're not giving an explanation, right? You're not leaving me with if I were to add this into the equation, I'm still left with just as much mystery, if not more. So it's not solving the mystery, right? It's only giving me a bigger mystery, right? Not solving the mystery. And so I mean, there was this one guy, right, a few months ago. This was I was going to say, this one guy who I was debating about it a few months ago, what he even said when I was asking about, is God himself complex? Like, I was saying, like, if you think that God is the explanation, tell me about what you think God himself is like. Is he complex? And how do you account for the improbability of him himself being set up in the right way without a cause if he is complex? And this is actually what he said to me, is that he said that it doesn't matter if God is complex or simple because probability doesn't apply to him because he created probability. And I mean, that's incredibly irrational. It's not possible for someone to create probability. What we're talking about when we're talking about the improbability of something is that when there's many alternative ways that something could when there's many alternative possibilities to something, right, the more alternative possibilities, the less likely it is, right? So if God doesn't have a cause, right, then he could just as well be set up in any random way, right? And so there's many alternative possibilities, right? That are just as much possible. The more alternative possibilities, the lower the probability. Simple as that. So it's not like probability is some type of like thing that you could create. And so it's just totally like just hand waving, not addressing like the the question that I'm giving, right? And so I mean, it really gets frustrating because like there's a lot of just like people being incredibly irrational, like not like they insist that this has to be the explanation, but then when you ask for the explanation for that idea themselves, they're just totally dismissive of it and just totally act like it doesn't make sense to ask the question of why God would himself exist. But logically, you can't just say that God himself is set up in an extremely exact perfect way without himself having an explanation, right? There would need to be an explanation, right? But they never address any of that, and yet they still like insist that all I need to do is just look around and it should be obvious that I mean, how does it explain what I see around me to say that there was a spirit that spoke it into being? That doesn't explain it, right? And so, you know, we're left with just as much mystery regardless if we say that there was a God, right? It doesn't solve the mystery, right? Um and so I mean the amount of like irrational arguments that people like insist upon, it gets frustrating after a while. All right, that's all for now. See you guys.